Welcome to the Feisworld podcast, engaging conversations that cross the boundaries between business, art, and the digital world.
Welcome to the Feisworld podcast. This is your host, Fei Wu. On this podcast, you will meet a variety of people who are extraordinary at what they do, including Caleb Brown, who's an artist, a user experience designer, Shang Li, who's a renowned Chinese artist, Michael J. O'Malley, Hall of Fame Lifetime Achievement Award martial artist, Matt Lindley, Director of Innovation at Sapien Nitro, Ralph Peterson Jr., who's a professor at Berklee College of Music, American jazz musician, Barry Alexander, Chairman and COO of Alexander Bueno International, and many, many more. And in addition, via these episodes, you'll get to know my guests through their experiences, interests, and influences. Each episode has a web page associated with tactics, tools, and ideas you can use. My guest today is Chris Heinen. Chris is a full-stack developer, a skydiver, and adventurist. Originally, I had wanted to name this episode Chris Heinen, a developer with his heart opens to the skies. But later I decided on something much punchier, right to the point of who Chris is. When searching for the definition of adventurist via Urban Dictionary, this is what I found. An adventurist is someone who would climb mountains, jump out of planes, and dive below the surface of the water in search of adventure. So this couldn't possibly be more accurate description of Chris. In October 2014, Chris and his wife took on a trip to Nepal for trekking. They hung out at tea houses on the Himalayas, stopped over Istanbul to experience its unique culture and food before returning to the States. Chris feels very fortunate for what he has. He realized the importance of travel as a venue to learn about other people around the world, to understand similarities and dissimilarities. Chris is also a fan of domestic travels. He recalls South Dakota and Utah are some of the most beautiful places he has ever visited. As a full-stack developer, Chris is an expert in both front-end and also back-end development. In part one of our conversation, Chris helps answer the question, to those of you who may be contemplating to become a developer, how do you get started? Chris speaks to the possibility for people who are interested in technology and development to also be self-taught. Also to remind them that in addition to the resources on and offline, you really need a personality to learn, to create, and constantly seek out new information. Remember that technology is always changing. As a struggling developer very early on in my own career, I asked Chris about how he conditions himself to stay relevant and also to get unstuck. As a digital project manager, a PM, I wanted to ask Chris about what makes the best, most ideal project managers. So make sure you tune in, and this is going to be an awesome episode with Chris Heinen. All right, welcome to the show, Chris.
Good morning.
Yeah, so over here it's October 28th in Boston. Believe it or not, it's going to be in high 60s today. That's one thing we talk about very often is the weather.
It's toasty, good biking weather.
Yeah. Did you bike to work today?
I did bike to work today, yeah.
Actually, I should ask the other question. What day didn't you bike to work?
Only when it's like ice and freezing rain out.
Yeah.
Otherwise, I try and bike as much as possible.
Wow. Did you ever bike in the snow?
We'll see this winter. Might have to put some like studs on my tires so I can make it, but I might give it a shot.
Nice. Awesome. So we, here at Arnold, everybody has heard the story. Not everyone, but yesterday, I remember on Monday, I witnessed dozens of people approaching you, asking you about your very exotic adventure that you've just taken on and returned from your 2.5-week trip. Mm-hmm. So actually, to save you time for the next 2 to 3 weeks or the next year, do you mind giving us like sort of an overview or kind of your experience during the trip? Where did you go?
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, it was a trip to Nepal for trekking, and then on the return flight home, we did a stopover in Istanbul for 3 days. Just kind of enjoying the culture, enjoying the food. After a couple weeks of trekking, only having rice, potatoes, and lentil soup, it was nice to go to Istanbul and have some kebabs and shawarma and really good Middle Eastern food.
Nice.
So yeah, we went to Nepal, spent a couple days in Kathmandu, drove up to the Langtang region where we did about like 10 days worth of trekking in the Himalayas. It was a pretty relaxed hike. It was a tea house trek. I mean,
I'm laughing. It doesn't. You have relaxing.
Well, it's relative. I've gone on other like hiking, like climbing trips before, where you're going up to like 19,000 feet, and there's lack of oxygen. You're constantly like uncomfortable because of the altitude. A little more technical with ice axes and crampons. Whereas this was, you're up in the Himalayas, but you're not using any like technical equipment like ropes and ice axes and crampons.
Oh, interesting.
It's just stroll in the mountains.
Why didn't you need the special equipment?
Well, this trip we like intentionally planned it to do more of like a cultural kind of experience. I studied Tibetan Buddhism when I was in school, and we actually had a chance to meet the Dalai Lama. He came to our university, and
What?
I spent like a whole year
Wow.
learning about Tibetan Buddhism. So for me to be able to go to this particular region in Nepal, it's one of the few places in the world you can see locals practicing Tibetan Buddhism. Like they're basically like crossed over the border from Tibet, Tibetan refugees that are just living their daily life. So to see just normal people living their lives and kind of experience that, that's what this trek was for me. It wasn't, let's get to the tallest mountain in the world. It was, let's spend a week staying in tea houses, traveling with our guides, and kind of immersing ourselves in their culture. Yeah.
Wow, this is fascinating. Probably have a million follow-up questions, but to kind of one of the first questions I have is, I can imagine the buildup of the trip. As your coworker, I think myself, along with a few other people, have sort of heard your plan, how you imagine this trip would go. And so in comparison to what you originally had envisioned to your actual experience, like how much of that actually overlapped versus very different than what you anticipated?
I mean, I feel like life in general is never going to really match up with your expectations, for better or for worse. And in this case, it was definitely for better. Like we had an amazing trip. My wife and I had an amazing time just kind of spending time with the culture. I think we were surprised by a lot of things because it's so different from what we have here in the States. I mean, both in Nepal, it's completely different. And on the way back, Istanbul was still like a completely different country. I mean, I had never been, prior to this trip, I had never been to a Buddhist temple, I'd never been to a Hindu temple, and I'd never been to a mosque. And we were able to basically like go to a country or go to a region where everybody is Tibetan Buddhist, and then return to Kathmandu, go to an area where like 80 to 90% of the country is Hindu. And then in Istanbul, it was 99% Muslim. So, so different than what you get here in the States. So you didn't really know what to expect. I definitely was pleasantly surprised.
Yeah. Why did you have to stop by over for 3 days? I think you mentioned yesterday.
Well, Turkish Airlines, similar to kind of like Iceland Air, they're trying to promote tourism in their country. So what the airlines does, I'm not sure if they have some kind of relationship with the government or with like the tourist department, but what they do is they encourage a stopover. I think they require a stopover for at least 1 day, and we just kind of saw that as an opportunity to like, let's stay for 3 days. Like I love Middle Eastern food.
Man.
And knowing that we were going to be hiking for a couple weeks, to have a couple days to kind of adjust to the time zone and indulge ourselves in baklava and
meat.
Kebab and meat. Yeah, coming from a Buddhist country where there's not a lot of meat, to go to Istanbul and just have kebab was amazing.
Yeah, but you still lost about 8 pounds,
I
8
lost
to 10
a ton of
pounds.
weight. Well, the thing is, like when you're hiking at high altitude, it's tough on your body. I mean, you burn lots of calories, but then also like I've experienced kind of like loss of appetite because you're always like a little bit. You're trying to control like. You don't want to get altitude sickness. There's that fear of altitude sickness. You don't want to get. You're always like a little bit dizzy, like a little bit nauseous. So like for me, like I definitely like lost my appetite a little bit, and I definitely like ate enough to have energy to hike. But when you're having like potatoes, rice, and lentils twice a day for 10 days, it's easy to lose your appetite.
I'm thinking if I were to go, I probably would lose 20 to 25 pounds because we will touch point on skydiving, base jumping, rock climbing, and all these like sort of very extreme sports that you do. And if you feel dizzy, and I can only imagine myself be vomiting like 10 times a day, I do want to touch base on your travel experience. To summarize, you've been to the majority, 38 out of the 50 states in America, and you've been to Canada. I'm looking at the list of countries from Africa, Asia, Central, South America, Europe. And so travel seems to be a sort of a very important element or a factor in your life. Have you started at a very young age? Was that inspired by your parents, or you've done most of the travels as an adult?
Well, the big trip that kind of kicked it off for me was with my grandmother when I must have been like 13 or 14. It was really important for her to see us, like the entire family, enjoy an inheritance together while she was still alive. So she actually went through and she took like all my cousins, aunts and uncles, the entire family on a trip to South Africa. And there we got to ride the Blue Train, went to Cape Town, got to experience like a world very different than what I grew up in. You know, being in Cape Town and seeing all like the privileged people that live in the city, and then 2 minutes outside of Cape Town, there's corrugated aluminum shanty towns, like where people don't even have clean water. You know, I remember seeing that, and that just opened my eyes. Like I was like, wow, there is a world very different. Like I'm very fortunate for what I have, and kind of after that moment, like I realized the importance of travel and that what you can learn about people around you in the world, learn about yourself. Like see the similarities and how things are dissimilar. I don't know, I just really enjoyed traveling after that.
Yeah, I totally echo that. Yeah. What's interesting was, you probably know this, I grew up in Beijing until I was about 16. I came out here, and I think, obviously, I was not the first generation of students or people from China to come study in the United States. But I noticed one of the missions I had was actually bring a lot of my friends back to Beijing and actually travel around China with me. I can imagine a dozen friends of mine from college, from where I practiced Taekwondo, and everybody's response was, "Oh my God, it was so different than what I had imagined." And obviously they're saying maybe because I have a tour guide, but also for some of my friends who didn't travel there with me, they're also saying that it's very different than what they've learned on the news, what they've learned from their parents, even people in sort of their trusted network. Fascinating. And I love the fact that you've taken initiatives much beyond the trip with your grandma to go to other parts of the world. So obviously we'll take 10 episodes of my podcast and we'll go through each country in your experience, your pictures. What are some of in addition to this, the South America, was it Africa? You said you're...
South Africa was kind of like the big first, like kind of initial trip that I went with my family that was like out of the country and very different from anything I had seen before. From there, done a bunch of travel in South and Central America, Asia, been to Japan, Nepal most recently, Europe, Turkey was on the return trip on this most recent vacation, which is kind of like Asia and Europe at like the same time, depending on what side of the river you're on. So that was a really interesting city. But yeah, I try and travel as much as possible. Like in college, did a couple cross-country road trips, spent 4 weeks traveling across the country, sleeping in the trunk of my car for 4 weeks, kind of checking out different states, which I definitely would recommend to anyone if they can do a trip across the country. Mm-hmm. You realize how huge America is, to just be driving straight for 3 days and just keep going, seeing the terrain change from ocean to plains to farmland to mountains to desert. Going to Utah and all of a sudden you're in Mars. It's like red rock and cliffs. It's just a amazing country to drive through.
Yeah. Well, I've actually known some of my friends who've also done trips across the country, and it's really amazing. And I feel like that's also a theme or a behavior for people after they graduate from college, take 2-3 months off, and literally take one car with 2-3 of their friends, so they could go in rotations and just find a motel whenever everybody feels tired. It's very, very adventurous.
Yeah, a lot of people focus on traveling internationally or getting outside the country. There's so much domestically to see that you could spend years just traveling around the United States and be completely happy.
That's fascinating. Since you've been to many more states than I have, and I imagine myself, I feel like I've gone around sort of the ocean line of New York, and the only spot I feel like I haven't been to is sort of Oregon and Seattle, but my job has taken me to many parts of United States. What are some of the states, or a state or a city that really surprised you?
I mean, South Dakota definitely exceeded my expectations. I didn't really know what to expect while driving through there. I guess I thought it would be just cornfields, but like southwest, like kind of the southwest corner of South Dakota, like some of the national parks there are really beautiful. Like going to the Badlands. And being able to just kind of walk around the entire park. There's no guardrails. You just kind of wander off into the hills. Did some caving there, too. Like, some of the caves are really amazing. Mount Rushmore is completely lame. Don't believe the hype. But the Crazy Horse Monument that's just down the road is unbelievable. I doubt I'll see it completed in my lifetime, but that was an amazing monument. I mean, it's still in progress. Basically, Rushmore could fit in the armpit of this monument. It's so big that they just stripped an entire mountain, and they're making this gigantic sculpture. That was beautiful. I mean, the Devil's Tower is pretty close to that area. It's really just an interesting spot that I wasn't expecting in the United States. Utah is beautiful too. That was something I wasn't expecting. Going to Moab with some friends. I didn't really know what to expect. And you roll down these canyons that are, these cliffs are the size of the tallest skyscrapers in New York City.
Wow.
And it's just these bright red rock. You feel like you're on Mars.
Yeah, it's fascinating because one of my first jobs, first clients actually, brought me to Arizona, Scottsdale, Arizona. And my mom was traveling with me at the time. It was so different than everywhere else I've seen in the States. And especially living in New England for so long, you're so used to the Tudors and sort of the red bricks, and all of a sudden the scenery changes completely. One of the things that really scared me was I was still relatively new to driving, especially 4 to 6 hours at a time. And I remember there was gas stations every 200 to 300 miles. And
you got to time it just right.
Yeah, exactly. Time it just right. So thank you so much for sharing with us your travel experience. And if our audience hasn't had the chance to read the blog post to get sort of this, how do I say this, into a sneak peek into who you are, what you do, it may be difficult to guess what you do professionally. And I do have a little map here of your career, and sort of as you mentioned earlier, 180 degree turnaround. So you've gone through a lot.
A couple 180s and 90s and a couple career chains. Yeah,
absolutely. And the latest, the role that I've known you in is a senior developer here at Arnold Worldwide. I feel very privileged to have worked with you on a number of projects. You're very different than a lot of developers I've known previously in my career. Now, again, I've worked with developer and actually was a developer myself, say, the past 8 years. really opened my eyes to some of the attributes that developers, whom I met didn't really have before. So I'm very fascinated about sort of speaking with you about your experience. So jumping into that, and I promise my audience that I will leave show notes so they know exactly when we start talking about development as a career.
Mm-hmm.
And if you could give us a sense of the type of developer you are, there's so many different types, software, and many others, front end, back end, and give us a sense for, who you are in this role.
Sure. Well, I guess I would be what they call like a full stack developer, meaning that I can do kind of like the gambit of development, ranging from front end work to kind of like more traditional back end work to system administration, working with servers to kind of set up a website.
Mm-hmm.
So kind of like the full range. And I didn't start my career out planning to do that.
Mm-hmm.
It's just kind of naturally happened over the years with my interest in kind of every little bit of the process.
Mm-hmm.
I've gradually learned everything, and with that knowledge I can kind of tackle the entire project, help lead projects. At one point I started out my career as a graphic designer too, so I can talk to designers. I kind of understand their perspective.
Mm-hmm.
So having that wide range I think has really helped me.
Give us a sense, I'm familiar with these terms, but I would imagine, here sometimes when you talk to account team, marketing team, what exactly is front end versus back end developer?
Mm-hmm.
And, how would you explain that to your 8-year-old, nephew, cousin?
Well, front end is more like the visual aspect of the website. So when a user logs onto a website and what they see is kind of like the front end. So that's anything from, fonts to images to animations. I mean, that's part of it. Front end is what is considered front end has changed quite a bit.
Yeah.
Because some of the languages that are associated with the front end, like HTML, CSS, JavaScript, which have traditionally been kind of like the user-facing, like visual side. It still exists as like the visual side, but things like JavaScript have come a long way. Where initially JavaScript was something that could handle different click events or handle animations on a page. Now you can build out really intense single-page applications using that same language. So kind of like the line between front end and back end has kind of blended at this point, where you're using a language, JavaScript, which is traditionally you think front end, but you're almost like a back end developer at that point because you're working with really complex AJAX calls. You're communicating with servers. You can even build like a server with JavaScript. So it's kind of blended.
I agree. And just working with you on a project very recently, I was exposed to AngularJS, JSON, JSON, whatever that's called.
Node.js.
Yeah, exactly. And it's fascinating, having studied computer science when I was in college, compared to all the tools, bells and whistles that now developers have access to. Back in the day, we had to spend months kind of developing. It's crazy, and almost make me think that now is a better time to be a developer. Who knows? So I think that leads to my next question is, now sort of, in my early 30s, I've probably not knowing from my the previous career of mine, I've always had the drive to help influence, kind of educate, and just really help junior people grow in their career. And some of my friends are still in school, much younger than I am, and many of them approach me asking me, what is it like to kind of develop a career as a developer? And I'm hesitant these days to answer that question because I haven't been a developer for a long time, so really good to have you on the show. What is your advice to people who are starting out in this path, and potentially people are still in school, schools are, undergrad or even graduate school? What is your advice, and what should they be doing
I was very fortunate getting started to have some really good mentors. You know, I didn't go to school for computer science. Wasn't a developer. I went to school to be an industrial designer and just kind of stumbled across web development, and it turned out it was something I really enjoyed. But I benefit from having a lot of mentors that kind of helped me along that path, kind of pointed me in the right direction, showed me the right languages to learn. So I think probably best advice is, if you're looking to get into a career in web development, is find a good mentor. And if you're lucky enough to have someone who's a developer in your group of friends, pick their brain, learn from them. If not, one of the great things that I did getting started was I took advantage of meetup groups. When I was living in New York City, there are so many different technology meetup groups constantly going on. And a lot of the times they wind up being just like a recruiting feeding frenzy, with a couple people talking about technology, and then 90% of the people at these meetups are trying to recruit and snag people out of the developers out of that meetup group. So it's a good way to find a job. But it's also a good way to kind of network and meet people, try and collaborate, try and do like a hackathon. And there's so many resources online to kind of teach yourself as well too. You know, the industry changes so much every single day that taking a computer science class and having something printed in a book, by the time it's been printed, it's already dated.
So true.
So it is very possible for you to be self-taught. A lot of the developers I know are self-taught, and you have to be. Like if you're planning to just go to school for it and then stop, you're going to be dated, and you're not going to be competitive in the market. You have to have the kind of attitude and personality to want to learn, create, and constantly seek out new information, because it's always changing.
This is great advice. Really awesome. Who were some of your mentors? And you know, I'm sure there are many names that may not even echo in your brain right now. Very thankful to them. Were they potentially even in school with you at the time? Were they kind of from your circle of friends who were professional developers at the time?
They were from my circle of friends. And it was actually, they were some of my skydiving friends. So like, actually this could be a good point too. I think one of the biggest things that's helped me out, kind of advancing my career and getting to where I am today, in addition to like all the friends that I've had, is get out of your comfort zone. You know, in college, you know, you're going to have a very limited set of friends that you can kind of use and learn from, and they all have very similar experiences what you have. I mean, you come from different towns, but you all have like very similar experiences. I was lucky enough when I started skydiving to get immersed in a completely different group of people, really interesting, adventurous, smart people. I mean, you have this image of what a skydiver is. You think of like Point Break, like, oh dude, get out of a plane. But realistically, like in order to do a sport like skydiving, you need to have the money to be able to jump. You know, there are skydivers that are just, you know, getting by, working in the sport, kind of getting by, and that's what they do. That's their life passion. And then there's people who are really successful in their careers, and they have the money to do a sport like jumping out of planes. So getting out of, I started skydiving when I was in school, to be able to leave the campus and meet all these new, interesting friends that I never would have encountered otherwise. That is what kind of took me to the next level. Like, I was able to meet, you know, developers that were already well along in their career that were able to mentor me, like Eric Lubau, Dave Holm. You know, these are all fantastic developers that I was lucky enough to kind of have mentor me, point me in the right direction.
If I may quickly interject and just agree. Why am I so agreeable? This is one point that really just lit up part of my brain to let you know that I felt exactly the same way when I went to Northeastern in Boston. I call it a city school. So, yes, we had a campus, but when you go to school in the city, that all your peers, friends kind of quickly disappear into the city, have their own things to focus on. And, you know, one of the questions I'm going to ask you in the end, which everybody seems to have the same answer towards, what would you say to your 18 to 20-year-old self? The theme is, relax. Just chill and relax. And when I was in school, I was very nervous. I didn't have a lot of confidence, but turns out I wasn't alone. Now, 8-10 years into my career, asking people, everybody was pretty freaked out and thought very little of themselves. And so instead, what I did was very similar to you, was I started doing Taekwondo when I was still a freshman in college. At my Taekwondo school, I had the pleasure to meet very different people. Doctors, lawyers, business people, artists, a whole spectrum of people. Many of them are older than I was. I was 18. Most of my friends were 28. I mean, exactly 10 years older than I was. And I felt, I felt so, in a very foster, very safe environment. I was able to learn so much more and kind of leave my own anxious self behind. One of the example was I was a developer, and that day I was so ready to transfer out of the college because I didn't think I was cut for it. And to your point, I couldn't get through the 1,000-page nonsense Java book, and I couldn't soak myself into the classroom. I felt pointless and wasted my money, honestly. And I went to Taekwondo, and I remember this Christina, she was 28, and she said, Faye, but what if you're a developer with a personality? What if you understand your interest in business? What if you can work with people? And literally that 30-second conversation changed my mind, and I withdrew my application to switch out of general studies or School of Business, I forgot. And I persevered through, 4 or 5 years of schooling computer science. And until today, I can call myself a technical PM, project manager, to be able to do things that a more generalist might not feel as comfortable taking on. So there's a long way of saying that there's a huge benefit to breaking out of your comfort zone.
Oh, yeah.
Getting to know more people, people who are diverse, be interested in different cultures, different domains. It's so dead on I think that's the core of the advice, if nothing else. And
it's an easy way to find that group if it's something you're passionate about, like Taekwondo or for me, skydiving.
Yeah.
You're with a group of people that all share the same passion.
So true.
It's almost like you have instant friends.
Yes.
And you're comfortable, and it's a great environment to learn.
And then
grow. I think I learned a lot more from those friends and kind of figured out who I was, getting out of my comfort zone than I would have had I just kind of stayed in my dorm room and hung out with the same group of friends, all the same age, all from basically the same upper middle class background going to college. So I would definitely recommend that. Get out of your comfort zone.
And proximity is another interesting observation. Unfortunately, this very famous business person's name, it just escaped my mind, but his story was coming from lower middle class, and he decided to work at a golf course, and instantly had access to people who are portfolio managers, and he became later on became one of the most successful sort of investors in this country. And I think it's really interesting, even if you're going for skydiving training, having fun, but not to overlook the conversations that you may be having on the way, maybe not after you jump out of the plane, but by the way, that JavaScript. So this is really fascinating, and I'm sorry we stay so long on that question. The next part is, again, I want people to be able to learn from you, even beyond this conversation, beyond this blog post. And I've come to realize that not everybody is as active as some of the others on social networks. Honestly, myself included, that I'm not crazy about Facebook or Twitter. But if people were to learn from you, to follow you, are you on any particular channels that you think you're sharing out your knowledge?
I like taking photos. I have an Instagram account. I tweet infrequently. I spend so much of my day working with social media that when I get home at night, I'd rather just go bike riding or do some woodworking or go rock climbing and enjoy my life.
No, seriously, plumber watching a plumber movie.
There's enough time on digital devices that it's nice to unplug sometimes.
Oh man.
Yeah.
I think you just revealed why I oftentimes want to kind of stay away from social channels.
And if it's something that if I'm looking to teach and connect with people, I'd rather do that in person. Yeah, I used to, when I was in New York City, I used to hold seminars and I used to teach web development. And that's how you connect with people. You know, the audience that you get on Instagram and Twitter, you know, it's not the same. You don't have that connection. And as soon as your post or your tweet isn't at the top of the queue, it's forgotten. So I would recommend human contact and actually reaching out to people if you wanna learn.
Yep.
Yeah.
Exactly. That's a really good recommendation. I actually know developers. I think that's kind of a counterintuitive response that you had. I know developers who are day in and day out, professional life, personal life, are always plugged into the wall. And for the longest time, I struggle with that concept. As in, you know, for me too, I want to go for a run. I want to go to yoga. I want to go to Taekwondo, you know, put it on a dobok and start practicing, you're integrating with my body, just not even going to a gym to run on a treadmill. I don't want my life to be attached to any devices, you know, whether it's a laptop or a treadmill or things along that line. So, you know, I do want to talk about, however, the ways that you condition yourself. That's one of my favorite questions. Conditioning, we'll talk about physical conditioning later, but condition yourself to be a developer. And the reason is that I really struggled. This is years ago in 06 or 07. I struggled to be a developer, to be that person that had to download the beta version of everything, stay on top, blog about them, criticize them, or promote them, Quora. And I felt completely exhausted having to do that, going to every meeting and some new gadgets, some you know, acronyms will show up and I wouldn't know what they meant. You know, as a 22, 23-year-old, I was very intimidated by that. So now, how do you condition yourself in two ways to stay on top of the latest and greatest, if that's the right way to determine that? And also, when you get stuck, when you get stuck, like what are some of the places, resources you would go to? You know, and I'll stop. Actually, that's a long, loaded question already.
This sounds it sounds like an interview question. Like, so what do you do when you get stuck on a problem? What sources do you use?
You're really good at that.
Probably like 90% of my day is spent on like Google and Stack Overflow. It's amazing, like what you can find, what people are contributing to the community. There are so many really talented developers out there that give back to the community, whether it's Stack Overflow answering questions, open source projects that people are contributing to. There's a wealth of information out there, and like you said, it's constantly changing. There's always the hottest new library. There's like, Marionette and Backbone and Chupacabra and like whatever the hot new name is going to be. And to keep up with that, because there's so many different fads, you can't really keep up with everything. You do your best. You follow blogs, you follow the news, you follow the forums to figure out what people are working on at that moment. But the fact is, it's constantly going to change. So one of the things that I found that only really comes from just experience working on projects, because that's when you really learn. You can do tutorials, you can read articles, but when you're actually working on a project and problem solving, that's where you retain a lot of information and a lot of knowledge. And with that, you get experience. And I found that it's not about knowing everything. You're never going to know everything. It's about knowing the right questions to ask. And luckily, at your fingertips, you have things like Google, that if you can ask it the right question, it will give you the right answer. And that kind of just comes with time. The more projects, the more times you beat your head up against a problem, the more times something breaks or it works, you find out the right questions to ask. You understand the different programming languages a little bit better so that you can ask specific questions that will return the answers that you're looking for. And at the very beginning, you don't know what you're looking for because you've never encountered the problem. But over time, it gets easier. Yeah.
So it was so funny. Yesterday, I must tell my audience that you contributed significantly to Feisworld.com, where I write about my interviewees and share show notes and all that jazz, one of the things that I really struggle big time with is the WordPress theme, which I love, had this flawed design of, basically you can't even see the homepage button. And if I might quickly articulate the process, the night before I spent a few hours, and I'm no expert in CSS. I knew that before I got started, but I said to myself, wow, I've been working for 8 years. I've come across a lot of big, small challenges. I'm going to condition myself to get through this problem. And I realized, to your point, I was asking myself a lot of the wrong questions. And as I was getting more and more tired and frustrated, I stuck around. I'm like, I need to get this resolved and done. And over time, it became less and less productive. So, again, loaded question. But I was wondering, when you truly get stuck, or what is that sort of time frame that you say to yourself, okay, it's been 2 hours. I've been on this problem. Should I go out for a walk? Should I talk to someone else? And people don't know when to stop. I think that's interesting. And I know that the gentleman who wrote Black Swan and Anti-Fragile, I'll quickly remember his name later on, but he said that walking is a daily routine, and not just once. He does it multiple times a day, and he's one of the greatest sort of authors, mathematicians of our time. And he said he thinks so much more efficiently when he walks. So anyway, what is your routine and conditioning method?
When I get stumped, huh?
Bike ride.
I'm much quicker to ask for help when I'm working on a project. It's great to be part of a team where you have a lot of really talented developers around you. And don't have an ego. If you have a question or if you're stumped, ask someone around you. It doesn't matter whether they're junior or senior. Everyone has a different perspective that's is different than yours, and it's valuable. So I'm very quick to ask for help, ask questions. If I get really stumped on something, there is a point where you're not productive anymore. If you've been working for 14 hours straight on a problem, the quality of that time at hour 14 is garbage. You're not going to figure it out. So go home, rest, have a life outside of work. Have a balance between work and life, so that way you can come back the following day and be refreshed and figure it out. I mean, that's happened several times for me, where you're stumped on a problem, you can't figure it out. You go away for a walk, you come back, and you figure it out in 10 seconds. It's just kind of how our brains work. You can't work at high speed for hours and hours and hours and expect to just brute force figure it out.
Don't beat yourself up.
Don't beat yourself up.
One of the things that I learned from James Altucher is be gentle to yourself. I think most of the time we're so harsh, and our brains are wired in a way that we're constantly looking for problems, tactics, resolution, and sometimes it's really important to give yourself a break.
Right.
In our industry and many others, I think,
and not just a 10-minute walk. I encourage actually having a life outside of work too. Do the things you're passionate about. Spend some time. If you're into running, go for a run. If you're an artist, do some art. Do something that's not staring at a screen. And it'll really help you focus when you get back to work.
It's great. And we have a lot of you don't just have a single hobby, you have a ton. So I think that's really fascinating to kind of touch base on them. I have one last professional related questions. Is oftentimes when you're not a tech lead, or even when you are, you tend to work with a project manager. In this case, I'm a digital producer. What are some of the important qualities of a producer, project manager that could really help you to perform your very best? And I think that's important. And I don't, we talked about this briefly before, is it's a one-way conversation oftentimes is when, marketing, account team will potentially either influence a job description, or they determine or describe what is a really awesome developer. But how does the reverse of that conversation response come about?
So what makes a good digital producer?
Yeah, project manager.
A project manager. I mean, the best project manager, best manager, leader in general is the one that you don't even realize they're there. Things just run smoothly. You are able to tackle your tasks, and you don't even realize they're there.
They know to get out of your way as well.
It's
needed.
It is getting out of your way, but it's also just kind of shielding you from the chaos of like the client and the politics and everything else that takes place. Shielding the developer, giving them the tools that they need to do their job, so that they can get heads down, finish what they need to do, play their role, and not even know what else is going on around them. You know, it kind of reminds me when I went to school for product design, industrial design. You know, the teacher would always say that the best design, you don't see the best design, you don't recognize the best design. It's where you have a flawed design, the ergonomics are off or something is off, that you recognize it and you complain about it. But good design doesn't get the compliments. So a good project manager or digital producer isn't going to get the compliments because they're like a ghost behind the scenes, making sure you have everything you need to get the job done.
When the things go sideways, and they're the first.
When there's any friction, then it goes right on the digital producer, and I do not envy that job.
Yeah, I agree, and I feel like it's something that I keep reminding myself of. What can I do? I feel like the core of my job is to enable other people on my team to do their very best. And also to acknowledge that oftentimes we work with constraints all day, every day. You know, these are the tools that you have right now. Sometimes that's budget, sometimes that's timeline. For me, this is maybe perhaps my recommendation to other project managers is to put yourself in their shoes as well. That's one. And two is really to trust their instincts. You know, at the end of the day, I know as project managers, we'll have interest or experience in possibly in design, development, but still, one example I could think of is, I think in a way that you really save one of the projects we worked on together by finding the iPad IPED database from the National Institute of Education. One of the most significant feedback after you're able to find it, and we have infinite access to these data that's completely unbiased, the client said, wow, this is amazing, because now we don't have to worry about legal approval anymore. And the client also said, this is something we're very familiar with. But that's not the information or the tools that we're given up front.
Right.
So you've done your research and immediately became very compelling and very promising. So in that case, I think it's important to really trust your instinct. And that also just shows, honestly, that you've done your research, your homework, whether that was Google, Stack Overflow, and you found the solution. So I think that's really important. So
yeah, that's a good point. I think you know, if you as a project manager or producer try and, you know, it's your baby, you want to protect it, and you have a particular vision for how it should be, you're not going to let the professionals that are working with you do their jobs. And you know, this project you're talking about started out very different, you know, but with the feedback of really smart people on our team, we were able to kind of steer it a different direction. I think we turned out with a better product than how we just stuck with what was initially discussed at the beginning. It kind of grew, and by staying flexible and empowering the people on your team that have specialties to do what they specialize in, you know, you walk away with something better than what you started out with.
Absolutely. Yeah. Sometimes I think that's they go too deep into risk taking. I think people need to condition themselves to be comfortable with a certain amount of risks.
Right.
I think we take risks every day, you know, the moment we get out of bed, even when you're still in bed. Right. So I think that's important to really challenge some of the ideas and to be collaborative, and then trust other people. And it's hard, you know.
Trust is important, especially if it's your baby, if it's the project that you came up with and your concept, to let it go and let it change and let it become something different. It's a hard thing for a lot of people, regardless of, you know, whether you're a developer or designer. Like, it's hard to have your baby turn into something else. But when you just have to trust that the team of people you're working with know what they're doing and have great ideas they can contribute. You know, it's better to have 5 brains than 1 brain.
Yeah.
You just kind of have to trust your team.
Absolutely. Otherwise, you could be a one-person company, right?
One-person company, you're going to kind of outcast the people you're working with. Motivation's going to drop off because now it's not each person's product. You know, it's your product. It's the manager's product, and no one else gets a piece of it. But as soon as you get involved, like each member gets involved, and they feel like it's their own, you're going to get a much better end result.
So that concluded part 1 of my conversation with Chris Heinen. In part 2, Chris speaks to his passion for jumping out of perfectly functioning planes. In his own words, it's a moment of zen. That's when we'll talk about skydiving as a form of meditation. So don't miss out, and I'll see you in part 2. To listen to more episodes of the Feisworld podcast, please subscribe on iTunes or visit feisworld.com. That is FEISWORLD, where you can find show notes, links, other tools, and resources. You can also follow me on Twitter at Feisworld. Until next time, thanks for listening.